Vamos a dar la bienvenida a nuestra próxima ponente, que es Elizabeth Hersen. Ella trabaja en MSD en Estados Unidos y va a hablar del papel de la industria. Good afternoon, Elizabeth. Welcome. And I have just introduced you, and this is your time. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you, and thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to attend the seminar today. So I will go ahead and share my, so before I get started, I will tell you a little bit about myself. I am an infectious diseases pharmacist by training and was in clinical and academic practice for several years before joining industry. And when I was in practice, I was responsible for starting up an antimicrobial stewardship program within a large academic medical center. And then I also had teaching appointments at the colleges of pharmacy and medicine, and really enjoyed that aspect of my practice before joining industry. Since joining industry, I have still been heavily involved in antimicrobial stewardship. My first industry position was with Cubist Pharmaceuticals, and there I started what we called our Antimicrobial Stewardship Outreach Group. And so we did a lot with education and research and collaborative research with external stakeholders. And then I also worked really closely with our government affairs group on different legislation and policy related to antimicrobial stewardship and resistance. And then MSD acquired Cubist Pharmaceuticals a little over 5 years ago now. And since my time at MSD, I have been responsible for helping to lead our global work on antimicrobial stewardship. And that does include across our human health business as well as our animal health business. So the disclosures are relatively obvious. I am a compensated employee of MSD, and the content that I will present today doesn't necessarily reflect the opinions of MSD. So first, I'll start by just showing this timeline, which I think nicely illustrates the fact that antimicrobial use is a key driver of antimicrobial resistance. And you've heard the saying that history often repeats itself, and that has come to bear in antimicrobial development and widespread use of antimicrobials, and then the subsequent development of antimicrobial resistance, which you can see on this timeline. So we have here the widespread use of penicillin, followed by penicillin-resistant pneumococcus. You see tetracycline resistance, erythromycin resistance, methicillin resistance. And so this cycle repeats itself over and over again, and again highlights the point that antimicrobial use is a key driver of antimicrobial resistance. And this is the case whether that antimicrobial use is appropriate or inappropriate. But the inappropriate antibiotic use is what's considered modifiable, that we can reduce inappropriate antibiotic use. So why do we care so much? Why is antimicrobial resistance a problem? There are a number of reasons, several of which are listed here on the slide, but ultimately it boils down to the fact that antimicrobial resistance is bad for patients, it's bad for healthcare systems, and it's bad for our society as a whole in terms of public and population health implications, as well as economic implications. And on top of that, new antimicrobials are limited. And so that really highlights the need for antimicrobial stewardship. So within the private sector, we do feel that we have a role to play in helping to address antimicrobial resistance. And if you think about antimicrobial resistance as a supply and demand problem, you can think about that we need to speed up the discovery and development of novel antimicrobials, antimicrobial alternatives, vaccines, and diagnostics. And so that's increasing the supply side of the equation. But we also need to slow down the emergence of resistance through better diagnostics, improved surveillance, and antimicrobial stewardship, or the responsible use of antimicrobials. And that's the demand side. So again, we need to kind of increase the supply and decrease the demand. And there have been a series of public commitments that have been made by the private sector. Some of you may be aware that back in 2017, the United Nations had a high-level meeting focused on antimicrobial resistance. And the World Economic Forum, which is held in Davos, around the World Economic Forum, several pharmaceutical companies and diagnostic companies signed on to what is now referred to as the Davos Declaration. And a series of public commitments were made in this Davos Declaration by those signatory companies. Subsequently, several companies issued what is referred to as the industry roadmap, which again just kind of provided further detail on those public commitments that were made and some additional public commitments. And then the industry formed what is called the AMR Industry Alliance, which is essentially a self-reporting mechanism where the companies that have made these public commitments have agreed to report on the progress against those public commitments every 2 years, with the most recent progress report coming out in 2020, last year. And so the next progress report from the AMR Industry Alliance will come out next year in 2022. So MSD is one of the companies that has signed on to both the Davos Declaration and is part of the industry roadmap. And we are one of the founding members of the AMR Industry Alliance. And we have had a significant history in the discovery and development of novel antimicrobials and vaccines to both treat and prevent infections in both humans and animals, as I mentioned at the very beginning. Our portfolio spans a wide range of antimicrobials, including antibacterials or antibiotics, antifungals, antivirals, antiretrovirals for HIV, as well as a number of vaccines. And again, this is across both human and animal health. Over the years, those products have saved millions of lives, and today we remain one of the few companies with a sustained commitment to research and development in infectious diseases. So it makes sense for us to be a part of those public documents like the Davos Declaration, the Industry Roadmap, and the AMR Industry Alliance. But we have taken it a step further as well. So many of you are probably familiar with the World Health Organization AMR roadmap. And the World Health Organization specifically recommended that each country develop its own national action plan for antimicrobial resistance. And so several countries have done so. MSD took it a step further, and we developed our own action plan for addressing antimicrobial stewardship and addressing antimicrobial resistance and advancing antimicrobial stewardship, or AMS. We issued that global AMR action plan in the margins of that United Nations meeting that I mentioned earlier in 2017. So our global AMR action plan has been in place for about 4 years now. We subsequently have released some of our own progress reports. So we do participate in the AMR Industry Alliance progress reports, but we also have issued our own documents on MSD.com that outline how we have followed through on the public commitments that we have made. The most recent update that we issued was in December of 2020, so just several months ago now. And then in May of 2021, so just a few months ago, we also issued a One Health position statement. And this One Health position statement is broader than just antimicrobial resistance and stewardship. but there is a significant amount of the content is devoted to antimicrobial resistance and stewardship, and just goes to echo the importance that we place on a One Health approach. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. So before I get into more specifics about MSD's approach to AMR and AMS, I think it is a good idea to level set in terms of what we think good antimicrobial stewardship looks like. Oftentimes when you use the term antimicrobial stewardship, people have some negative connotations come to mind. And so sometimes you'll hear terms like it's the antibiotic police, or it's just a drug cost minimization program that's run out of the pharmacy. And unfortunately, that oftentimes is how antimicrobial stewardship is practiced, where it is focused on drug cost and solely aligned with the pharmacy budget. But what good antimicrobial stewardship should look like is, instead of being centered around finances, it should be centered around the patient. And instead of being focused on drugs, it should be disease state focused, because we want to look at the patient outcomes and the disease in a holistic way. And how can we manage the disease most appropriately to optimize patient outcomes? And so you want to see antimicrobial stewardship programs be tailored to the locale, so tailored to the individual hospital or setting where the antimicrobial stewardship program is in place. You also want to see the program track and report metrics, and ideally that should happen on a consistent and regular basis. And when you think about metrics for antimicrobial stewardship programs, you want to try to go beyond drug cost and drug utilization measures. Drug utilization measures are frequently used because they're an objective piece of information that can be relatively easy to collect. There are some challenges there as well. And it allows for benchmarking across institutions. But you also want to be thinking about some other buckets of metrics to collect as part of good antimicrobial stewardship. And those include clinical outcomes, so the outcomes that we care about in terms of patient care, unintended consequences of antimicrobial use. And so that's where things like antimicrobial resistance, adverse effects associated with antimicrobial use, as well as the selection of pathogenic organisms that's driven by antimicrobial use. So things like Clostridium difficile or Clostridioides difficile infection. So those are some examples of the outcomes that you want to look at. And then you also have a bucket for process measures. And that's where things like adherence to clinical pathways or time to antibiotic start. And then your drug cost and drug utilization measures would fall as another bucket of outcomes that you can look at for antimicrobial stewardship. Ideally, antimicrobial stewardship programs should be aligned with patient safety or quality of care and not necessarily driven solely by the pharmacy department. And antimicrobial stewardship programs should have consideration of not only individual patient care, but also the impact on population health. And that's one unique thing about antimicrobials, is that each individual person that uses an antimicrobial is impacting the effectiveness of that antimicrobial for the rest of the population when you think about the selection exposure for the potential development of antimicrobial resistance. So now getting back into MSD's approach to antimicrobial stewardship and resistance. Oftentimes one of the questions I get is, why does MSD care about antimicrobial stewardship? Why does it matter to a pharmaceutical company? And there are several reasons, and so I'll go through the wheel on the slide here, starting at the top. So the most important reason is that antimicrobial stewardship improves the quality of care that is provided to patients. So if the right drug, the right dose, the right duration, the right diagnosis, if all of those things happen, then the patient should have better outcomes. And ultimately, that's what we all care most about, is better patient outcomes. Antimicrobial stewardship also helps increase awareness of the impact of antimicrobial resistance, as well as local patterns of the local epidemiology patterns of antimicrobial resistance, which helps increase the recognition of the need for novel antimicrobials. If you don't understand the impact of antimicrobial resistance, the patterns in your local area, and you don't have that level of awareness, then you don't necessarily recognize when you need certain antimicrobials in your locale. Responsible use of antimicrobials also helps slow the development of antimicrobial resistance, which I mentioned is one of those unintended consequences. And this, in turn, helps prolong the longevity of the molecules that are commercially available now. So if you have an agent that is used irresponsibly and antimicrobial resistance develops very quickly and becomes widespread, then that agent is pretty much off the shelf. It's not very useful anymore. And so antimicrobial stewardship is really important when considering the lifespan of the available antibiotics that we currently have today. Antimicrobial stewardship also supports the broader portfolio of many pharmaceutical companies, MSD included. So we have a portfolio in oncology. We have a portfolio in diabetes. We have agents commercially available in populations that are at high risk for antimicrobial resistant infections. So if we don't have effective antimicrobials to treat those infections, those patients unfortunately may die and have, the worst outcome that we can think of, and not be able to benefit from agents in other parts of the portfolio. So that's another reason why antimicrobial stewardship is often important to a pharmaceutical company like MSD. Antimicrobial stewardship also allows us to partner with external stakeholders on a significant public health need. And so it allows us to work together to create shared value or integrated value, where we can see a benefit both to our company, but also to population health as a whole. And then lastly, as I mentioned, we have a long legacy in infectious diseases, and it only makes sense for us to be committed to the responsible use of these agents in order to save and improve lives, which is consistent with our mission. And so it strengthens our credibility to be transparent and authentic in how we work in the infectious disease space. I have mentioned a couple times now the concept of One Health. And so One Health, down at the bottom of the slide here, can simply be defined as communication, cooperation, and collaboration across human health, animal health, and environmental health. So really, it's a recognition of the interconnectedness that we all have on our planet. We're on a shared planet. And when you think about antimicrobials as a precious resource that is a shared resource, that gives it a different context. And that just further illustrates kind of the One Health perspective or One Health thinking when it comes to antimicrobial resistance and the importance of antimicrobial stewardship. So if you think of our approach, our MSD approach to AMS and AMR, we really have One Health at the foundation. So if it's like a structure or a house shown here on the slide, One Health is the foundation. And then you have things like infection prevention, research and development for discovery of new agents and vaccines, and diagnosis and surveillance. Those are the key structural pillars that really form the that main structure and give it strength. And then antimicrobial stewardship is the roof. So it's kind of like the protection or the preservation. So again, if you're thinking about antimicrobials as a shared resource amongst all of us on planet Earth, you need to think about how we can preserve that resource. And so if you think about antimicrobial stewardship as kind of the protective roof, that's an analogy that we use in terms of our approach to antimicrobial resistance is kind of this house or building. We also have tried to build antimicrobial stewardship into every aspect of our antibiotic development timeline or life cycle. So starting at the very beginning in terms of what indications we're going to look at in our clinical trials, to how we design our clinical trials, how we manufacture our products, how we promote our products, what we evaluate after our products are commercially available, how we conduct surveillance, and the partnerships that and programs that we engage in terms of supporting responsible use. So again, really thinking about it across the entire life cycle and trying to implement antimicrobial stewardship at each step along the way. And then additionally, we have advocacy for policies that try to enable access to new antibiotics, diagnostics, and vaccines. And of course, that's very important because it doesn't make sense to bring those things to market if there isn't access. We also have a cross-functional antimicrobial stewardship council. And so this is a group of senior leaders across the company that meets on a quarterly basis. And it's a mechanism to really continue to maintain momentum around our antimicrobial stewardship work and get buy-in and endorsement from the most senior leaders within our company that have a stake in antimicrobial resistance and stewardship. And then one of the more recent things that I'll mention, in May, we launched an internal antimicrobial stewardship curriculum that is available for all employees at MSD, so approximately 70,000 people around the world. And it's an online learning curriculum with 3 different modules to help raise awareness about antimicrobial resistance and the impact that it has, and teach our employees about the importance of antimicrobial stewardship or the responsible use of antimicrobials. And then this wheel shows the 4 main categories of activities where we feel that we can play a role as a pharmaceutical company. I have listed just a few examples in each of these 4 categories on the slide, and I can talk very briefly about these examples, but I would refer you to the article that is referenced at the bottom of the slide in Clinical Infectious Diseases, because this provides kind of a case study of the role that a pharmaceutical company can play in antimicrobial stewardship, using MSD as an example and providing more examples and more information about those examples. So within antimicrobial stewardship, as I mentioned, we focus our activities around education, implementation, research, and advocacy. And so just a few examples here. CIDRAP is the Center for Infectious Diseases Research and Policy, and it's out of the University of Minnesota, but their website and the antimicrobial stewardship microsite that is part of their website is intended for an international audience. And so although it's run out of the United States, the scope is really a global scope. And their advisory panel includes a global advisory panel. So it's not limited to a United States audience. If you are not familiar with the website already, I would really highly recommend that you check it out. There are a lot of really useful resources on the website. You can also sign up for the daily news scan. So you'll get an email at the end of each day with the top kind of 3 to 5 headline grabs that are related to AMR and AMS for that particular day. And again, it's global in scope. And you can also sign up for the Antimicrobial Stewardship newsletter, which is sent, I believe it's on a weekly basis. I need to refresh my memory on that. But I believe I get it every week. And it is really just an excellent way to read for 5 minutes a quick snapshot of kind of the main things that have happened over the past week. And then it has links if you're interested in diving deeper into any of that content. The CIDRAP team also hosts podcasts as on a variety of different topics. And then there also is a platform on their website where if you're looking for a certain clinical tool, for example, if you were thinking about designing a clinical treatment pathway in your hospital for ventilator-associated pneumonia, you could go to the CIDRAP site and search for clinical treatment pathways for ventilator-associated pneumonia. And any institutions that have developed a pathway that are willing to share it, that information will be posted there. And so it's only publicly available information that institutions have already posted on their website, but it's a nice way of kind of aggregating it all together so that you don't have to do the work of going from institution to institution to institution to try to find that information. Another project that I worked very closely on was an urgent care campaign. And I'm not going to talk a lot about this project other than sharing that there is a publicly available website from this project as well. And it's antibioticsandyou.org. And it is intended for a public audience. So while CIDRAP is more for healthcare providers and policymakers, the ARAC website is intended more for a public audience. That website is more US focused, but it could easily be modified for a more global audience. And when they developed the website, they really were careful about taking health literacy into consideration. And so the messages to the public are very simple, very brief, very easy to understand. So it's a great example of how to talk to the public in an easily understandable way. The Time to Vaccinate program is out of our animal health business. And this was a program to encourage cattle farmers. It started in Europe and has expanded from there. But it was specifically to encourage cattle farmers to vaccinate their cattle. And so really just emphasizing the importance of vaccination in terms of preventing infections to begin with and helping to reduce antimicrobial use in agriculture. On the implementation side, I'll skip to the second bullet, which is that MSD, so my department within MSD, Social Business Innovation, is the department that I sit in. We gave a series of internal grants to MSD affiliates around the country around the globe for projects in 7 different countries to help advance antimicrobial stewardship within those countries. And Spain is one of the teams that received a grant for their antimicrobial stewardship project. CDEP is the Center for Disease Dynamics, Economics, and Policy. And this, and GARP is the Global Antimicrobial Resistance Project. And we gave a grant to CDEP to expand their global antimicrobial resistance project. And so what they're doing as part of that, I mentioned the WHO has recommended that every country develop its own national action plan for AMR. And CDEP's GARP is trying to work with individual countries, in particular LMICs, low to middle income countries, to develop those national action plans if they don't already have one, and then to take those national action plans from paper to action and actually implement the national action plans. And so that is one of the things that we have supported as well. On the research side, a couple things that I'll mention here. We have our study for monitoring antimicrobial resistance trends, or SMART, on the human health side. And recently we launched a new website that provides broad access to the SMART surveillance data. And so that is something, part of the data is now publicly available through that website. And then we also now have a process in place where research organizations or research institutions can request access to more of the in-depth SMART data for specific research projects. And that was not a process that we had in place before. So really trying to not only continue our surveillance programs, which have been very long-standing. SMART has been in place since 2002, so almost 20 years now. So not only to continue those programs, but also to provide more access to the data from those programs. We also have, many of you who have worked with pharmaceutical industry are probably familiar that most companies have an investigator-initiated study program where you can submit proposals for research studies based on their defined areas of interest. Most of the time, those programs and areas of interest are related to a particular product that the pharmaceutical company has. We are unique in that we have an investigator-initiated study program, which is a global program for antimicrobial stewardship. So it is specifically brand agnostic. It should not be associated with a specific product of ours. And those areas of interest are posted every year. And there is a call for proposals once per year. For 2021, that call has already passed, but that's something to be aware of for 2022, to be thinking about if there might be a research project that you would want to submit as part of that investigator-initiated study program. And then MSD is also one of the contributors to the AMR Action Fund. And we were one of the lead contributors with $100 million over 10 years to try to stimulate the development of 2 to 4 new antibiotics by the year 2030. So it's basically $10 million over each year, over 10 years, to try to develop 2 to 4 new antibiotics. And then on the advocacy side, our policy group is very active in terms of advocating for not only push incentives, which tend to incentivize early antibiotic discovery, so things like research tax credits, but also pull incentives, and that's more for later stage antibiotic development and commercialization to try to ensure that we have a sustainable marketplace for antibiotics. And that's where things like market entry rewards or reimbursement reform come into play. I already talked about our MSD Global AMR Action Plan, and so that is a key tool that's used by our policy group. And then on the environmental side, which I haven't talked much about, the AMR Industry Alliance is also very active on the environmental side and has really, the pharmaceutical industry has really been shaping a lot of the discussion on the impact that manufacturers can potentially have on the environment when it comes to antimicrobials. And one of the things that has been done is the development of this common antibiotic manufacturing framework. And that has essentially set the standards for manufacturing antibiotics in a responsible way with effluent targets, so the waste targets. Those levels have been set for, I think, 130 different antibiotics at this point now. So really taking a very structured approach to trying to ensure that we're manufacturing our agents in a responsible manner as well. So at this point, you might be wondering if I forgot all about COVID-19 and am forgetting that we're in the middle of a pandemic right now. And I have not forgotten about it. And it's worth mentioning for several reasons. COVID-19 relative to antimicrobial resistance and stewardship has really highlighted how it has exposed our vulnerability to infectious diseases overall. And it's really highlighted our vulnerability in the case where we don't have the diagnostics, the treatments, or the vaccines that we need. When you think back to the early days of the pandemic, we didn't have those things in place, and we really saw the impact that infectious diseases can have on population health and the economy when we don't have treatment, diagnosis, and vaccines. We also know that COVID-19 was kind of a sneak attack. It was a little bit of an ambush. We didn't know that it was coming. There are certainly public health experts that will argue that we should have known that it was coming, but in many ways, it was an ambush, a sneak attack. Antimicrobial resistance is not. We know we have a problem with antimicrobial resistance, and it's a problem here and now. It kills about 700,000 people every year around the world. And so it is a significant public health and population health threat. And what we've seen with COVID-19 is some of the behaviors that have happened as a result of COVID-19 are likely going to make antimicrobial resistance worse down the line. So we've seen that antibiotic use in patients that are hospitalized for COVID-19 occurs in about 72% of those patients. Yet bacterial infections are only present in about 7% of those patients. So that goes to show you that there are a lot of patients that get hospitalized with COVID-19 and are treated with antibiotics when they don't actually have a bacterial infection. So that's inappropriate treatment that could potentially be avoided, and exposing those patients to the antibiotic, which again creates that selection pressure for antimicrobial resistance. And then we've also seen that antimicrobial stewardship efforts, so personnel as well as specific programs that are in place, have been diverted to COVID-19 specific activities. We've seen PPE, personal protective equipment availability, wax and wane. We've also seen burnout of healthcare providers and workforce challenges of getting enough people and having the capacity to take care of the COVID-19 patients that are being seen. And all of those things, those diversions and lack of availability, et cetera, have been shown to lead to an increased rate of hospital-associated infections as well. So COVID-19 has not only exposed our vulnerability in our current state, but it's also led to a lot of changes in practice and behavior, et cetera, that are likely to make that vulnerability to AMR even worse down the line. And the last thing that I'll mention about COVID-19 is that it has also shown us that a One Health and One World approach is absolutely needed for infectious diseases. Infectious diseases know no boundaries. They don't know borders. So we need to think about the world as a whole, not only for COVID-19, but for antimicrobial resistance and stewardship as well. So that brings me to my last slide, which is, so what? What do we do now? And so on this slide, I have just highlighted 4 different groups. There are many other groups that could be included here, but I've selected 4 different groups with a call to action for what needs to happen to try to address antimicrobial resistance and promote antimicrobial stewardship. For governments and policymakers, I think it's really important that they work with industry to help ensure a viable and sustainable market for antibiotics. And that goes back to those push and pull incentives that help address many of the regulatory, economic, et cetera, challenges that we encounter across the antibiotic life cycle. For scientific organizations, it's really important to ensure that guidelines are updated on a regular basis to reflect the newest agents that are available with the most recent evidence. And those guidelines also need to be disseminated widely so that clinicians are aware of the guidelines and can use the most recent evidence to make the best treatment choices for their individual patients. For clinicians, I would say make friends with your antimicrobial stewardship team within your institution. And again, make sure that you're aware of the most recent guidelines. And then for everyone, for all of us, we can prevent infections. If we prevent infections from ever happening in the first place, then we don't have the need for antibiotic use. We don't have that selection pressure for the development of antimicrobial resistance. And so these are a lot of the messages that we've been hearing with COVID-19. Get your vaccinations, wash your hands, cover your cough, stay home when you're sick, etc. Those are things that are just general infection prevention measures that are not specific to just COVID-19. So those are things we should be doing all the time, especially making sure that we stay up to date on our vaccinations. So with that, I will close the presentation and I would be happy to entertain any questions. And thank you for your attention.
Perfecto. Okay, thank you so much, Elizabeth. I think that we have enough time for 1 or 2 questions. ¿Alguna pregunta para Elizabeth?
Yes, thank you very much, Elizabeth, for the presentation. I just want to make 1 question because you have highlighted, obviously, the antimicrobial stewardship, but in your perception, what should be the role of diagnostic stewardship in all the antimicrobial stewardship?
Yeah, so that's a great question. What is the role of diagnostic stewardship along with antimicrobial stewardship? So one of the things that we follow at MSD is what we refer to as the Star of Stewardship. And the 5 points of the STAR are drug, dose, duration, de-escalation, and DOOR, with DOOR standing for the setting of care. So treating the patient in the right setting, whether that's in the hospital, outpatient, etc. At the center of the STAR is diagnosis. And so having an accurate and timely diagnosis is absolutely critical for being able to select all of those other factors, choosing the right drug, duration, dose, etc. So we are in a situation where we have a lot more advanced diagnostics than we used to have. And so the need for diagnostic stewardship has become a thing as well, because you don't want to unnecessarily use tests, but you do want to make sure that you're applying those tests for the right patient at the right time, etc. And so many of the concepts that I talked about in regard to antimicrobial stewardship also apply to diagnostics. And they really go hand in hand because that accurate and timely diagnosis is key to accurate and timely appropriate antimicrobial therapy.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? Well, I have another one, and MSD is a company that works in human health and also in animal health. Do you think that this gives us an advantage to work or for working with public administration for a One Health perspective?
Do I think that it gives us an advantage to have human health and animal health business?
Yes.
Yes, I do. I think that it puts us in a very unique position because we have both a human and animal health business. In many other cases, or I would actually venture to say in most other cases, companies have either a human health antimicrobial business or an animal health antimicrobial business. And that has created, unfortunately, a lot of antagonism between the human health community and the animal health community. MSD is in a unique position because we have both under our umbrella. And so we have those open lines of communication, collaboration, cooperation that I mentioned that serves as that One Health foundation to our approach. And so it allows us to think about how we can address antimicrobial resistance and help promote or advance antimicrobial stewardship from a much more holistic perspective.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we can finish with that. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation and your attention today.